This is Grape Video 35, Tying Grapevines, Part 1, Vineyard Situations Requiring Tying. The vineyard task of tying can be defined as fastening parts of a grapevine to a trellis or other support structure. And you can see several photos here of people in the process of tying grapevines. Few comments about tying before we get into the actual presentation of methods. Every grape grower ties grapevines, but there is often very little information available about this fundamental and essential vineyard task. Perhaps no two growers tie vines in exactly the same way, and that's important to remember. This is a very creative process. There's no one correct way to tie grapevines. There are many ways, and there are many options from which to choose. A grower often adopts grapevine tying techniques based on how it is done in his neighborhood or the area where he lives, or because of claims made by those selling tying products. The following 4 videos will give the grape grower numerous options from which to choose his or her own strategy for tying grapevines. Here is a picture in spring, about mid-May here in southern Michigan, and I put this in here to show the orderliness of the vineyard at this time of year. This is actually my very favorite time of year in the vineyard. Not even harvest is as important to me in terms of satisfaction as this time of year, because everything now looks orderly, everything looks crisp and new, the new growth, and that's only possible because we have tied the vines to make them this orderly. I enjoy this time of year in the vineyard. So here we are in the vineyard in mid-May, going through with the sprayer behind us, applying an application of fungicides and enjoying the orderliness of the vineyard. So we hope that these videos on tying will give you the skills to create a nice order to your vineyard so you can enjoy springtime in the vineyard as much as I do. Products mentioned in this presentation are for educational purposes only. No endorsement of those products is implicitly or explicitly intended. A little bit on the cost of tying, because it's no small matter. Often years ago we would say it takes 2 days of labor to tie an acre of vineyard. If we put 800 vines per acre down, for example, and we would say that it took a little over a minute to tie a vine, and that's pretty fast, that adds up to 16 hours. And at $10 an hour, which is a pretty modest price, we've got $160 there, and let's add another $50 for materials, which could range quite a bit. So we've got over $200 per acre in, at a minimum, for tying many vineyards. That's why a major consideration for the choice of a training system is how much annual tying is required. This very old picture that I took in California years ago illustrates midway or cordon training, and you can see with the spur pruning there really isn't a need for annual tying of any amount whatsoever. So that can be a major advantage of some training systems. On the other hand, this old picture in a cold winter's day in a Finger Lakes vineyard in New York shows umbrella niffin trained vines with long canes, and they do require a lot of tying every spring when they're trained that way. Here's another old picture from the Finger Lakes of umbrella niffin trained Concord vines, and if I go to the next slide, you can see right here all the little white dots on those vines. Those are actually twist ties, hundreds and hundreds of twist ties used to tie those vines back on the trellis each and every spring. And that's quite a large task. That's why in recent years more and more of these vineyards have been converted to a top wire cordon training system that requires much less tying. Here's a picture of our vinifera vines in a variety trial at the Southwest Michigan Research Center, and we've had to prune out all the old dead cordons and many old dead trunks, and what waits us now in this springtime is to get those canes that are alive tied back on the wire. We're a little behind schedule here. We'd like to have tying done before any bud break, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. Okay, we're going to start with Grape Video 35 here, Part 1, Vineyard Situations Requiring Tying. Then we'll go to Part 2 and talk about the many kinds of materials that can be used to tie grapevines. Video 37, Part 3, will actually show you the techniques involved in tying grapevines. And then, as a special add-on, we're going to talk briefly about different knots that are used for tying grapevines with twine, because that's a special case. And if you're not interested in that, you can just skip that video. So that's the plan. 4 grape videos covering the topic of tying. So let's begin Part 1, Vineyard Situations Requiring Tying. We could start with newly planted vines, and when newly planted vines are planted without any support structures, such as this, well, then there's no tying. There's nothing to tie to, and this is actually my preferred way of starting a vineyard on the ground, so to speak, growing it without a trellis the first year, and then putting the trellis in between year 1 and year 2. But sometimes people will elect to have individual vine stakes by each new vine and tie the vines to those stakes. This is a pretty meager picture of that situation because I don't have really much experience with individual stakes. Right here is the red line showing a metal stake that has been placed by each vine. We take it away so you can see it. And that is being used to train up the shoot around that stake so it will form a nice straight trunk in future years. Sometimes the stakes are not metal, they can be bamboo or wooden stakes. I really don't favor this approach to training of young vines. If you're going to want to train them up off the ground, put the trellis in. Several of the tying techniques that we're going to show you can keep nice straight trunks without the use of these various stakes that have to be bought, put in the vineyard when you're done, taken out. I think a lot of extra cost that really isn't necessary if you use some of the other tying techniques that we'll show you. Now, yes, if you put trellis in the first year when you plant the vines, newly planted vines, then there's several options for how to tie those vines. Here is a case of an experiment we had years ago with grow tubes, with and without and so forth, and in order to train the vines up off the ground in that year, we used twine tied to the top wire, and then we train the shoots up those pieces of twine till they can get up to and out the wires of the trellis. And we're going to show you how to make those ties with twine on the vine in various ways. Here's a vineyard in its second year. It had been winter killed to the ground the previous year, And a piece of twine is attached to the base of each vine, tied to an upper wire, and that's the only time needed to get those shoots up to where they can then be placed on the trellis wires. So here's a schematic that would show how a vine growing typically in its second year might be handled as you get more and more shoot growth during the season. Here's the piece of twine that we mentioned is tied from the base of the vine to the top wire, and then as growth occurs and we get those shoots coming up around that piece of twine, we start to add loose ties like these shown here. And sometimes when we put stuff out the wire, we would use loose ties along the wire. Many times we don't even need to do that. We can just wrap the shoots around the wire and the tendrils will hold it. But you would start to tie the vine as it's filling out the trellis in that second year, so that all the tying is done in a way that it won't girdle the vine. And here's what that sort of looks like, sort of later in the second year of a vineyard. Stuff has been brought up, trained out the wires, everything's up off the ground so that it can be sprayed well. Okay, here's another situation for the start of a newly planted vineyard, and we're going to look at how twine has been used to train shoots as they grow up during the first growing season of this vineyard. First of all, those are the stubs or spurs, if you will, that exist at the base of the vine, and in this case the twine has been tied onto those so it won't do any girdling at the base of the vine. There, we take those away and you can see where the twine has been tied onto those spurs. As we work up, the twine has been actually tied from those spurs up to a wire, and then the shoots as they grow are twirled around that twine like that. And as the shoots grow more, they are then wrapped around a wire going out horizontally, and that establishes a really nice structure to this very young vine with twine tied from the base of the vine to an upper wire and then the shoots wrapped around it. Okay, let's take some other situations that require tying in the vineyards. Let's look at long canes that come from the ground or the graft union that need to be supported. We'll consider those to be either new trunks on new vines, or they could be trunk renewals on old vines. Either way, we need to support a trunk renewal cane from the ground up on the trellis. Schematically, it might look like this. Or it might have a spur at the base like this. We can handle it either way. One way to tie them up is to put twine on that spur, as we've shown in the previous video, and then bring it up to the top wire, and we can tie it around the cane so that it will be held perfectly vertical to make a nice young straight trunk. Here's the close-up of the twine on that spur that was left for that purpose. And here is a picture showing how the twine then is placed around that cane so that it is held perfectly vertical. This is why I like this technique rather than using stakes or rods or anything of that nature. This is easier and very effective. Here's another picture in another situation with a piece of orange plastic twine doing the very same thing. Now, if we get long enough growth, we may want to do more than just have that cane come up to the top wire. We may want to use even a greater length of a nice long cane to begin establishing, say in this case, a new cordon out the top wire. And that's perfectly fine. The same tying of the vertical portion of that cane applies, and then we'd probably want to add to the end of that cane, right about there where that yellow dot is, a tie of sorts that will hold that cane tightly to that top wire. Another way to support a cane coming up from the ground, up on the trellis, is to put a piece of twine around the node right at the top of that cane, as shown here, and then tie that to the top wire. No need to have twine all the way to the base of the vine. We may or may not want to add a loose tie around the midsection of that cane on a lower wire or not. Here's what that looks like at the top of a cane tied to the top of a wire, and we're going to show you how to make that type of application in the next video. Now there's all kinds of variations to this idea. We can have two canes coming up to have a double trunk vine, tie them like that, or we can have spurs at the base of each of those and tie them with the long twine all the way from the base to the top like that, or the canes can be separate from each other with two totally independent trunks like that. Or I like to tie them like this at times because the leaf area that develops in that second year gets better exposure to sunlight when we spread those trunks out. They can be brought back vertical the next year to complete the training of the vine. Here's what that looks like in the vineyard. And as the season progresses, that will allow the leaf area on each of those canes to develop better because they're not competing with each other, being close together. A third situation requiring tying in the vineyard is supporting established trunks. Let me show you what I mean. This is my old dear friend Monty's stamp many, many years ago in an old vineyard on his farm. And years ago, when we grew grapes, we often used soft wire that would contract in the wintertime and expand in the summer, and we would get sagging trellises with sagging vines, and the trunks would become crooked. I can see a couple of wires in this picture that look like they've been cut and then put back together to make the wires tight again from the middle of the row. And it was common in those days, and there are needs today on occasion, to tie trunks that are bowing out into the row back against the trellis so they're out of the way of the tractor. There's a close-up to show a twine tie on the old trunk to keep it close to the trellis wire. And if you look below, the renewal that Monty's working with has been tied to the old trunk with a piece of twine down below to also help keep it into the middle of the trellis and not bowing out in the row. So you may have a need at times to make some ties like this in your operation to keep stuff out of the way of the tractor. Now, tying is also required when establishing cordons. Here's a schematic of the start of a mid-wire cordon training system, and we show two canes that are brought up from the ground and run out to the ends of the vine space. Certainly we need to put a tie on the outer edges of both of those canes to keep the cane secured to that wire for the season. And we're going to show you a technique with what I call a triangular tie that can be tied right back in the middle of the vine space so that those canes won't pull apart from each other and create a great big void in the growth of the grapevine in the middle of the vine space. So we'll show you that too. While we're at it, we'll just remind you from a previous video, when you're establishing a new cordon, don't overwrap the canes. Try to get one complete wrap about every 18 inches. I want to go back to this triangular twine tie that I just mentioned, and here's another schematic where we use it on older vines to keep canes together in the middle. Sometimes we would even use it to put twine on a wire and then bring it out and around a trunk that's bowing out into the row. If you have this in your tying bag of tricks, you'll find a use for this triangular tie periodically for various parts of the vines, and we're going to show you how to make that in one of the upcoming videos. Okay, number 5, the fifth way that we use tying in the vineyards is to secure long fruiting canes. This is a Concord vine that is trained umbrella niffin. And although this isn't used a lot anymore, it still is used in some instances. And we put this in to show you that when we're tying canes like this, we would take the ends of the canes, as shown here with the red loops, and we would tie those tightly so that the cane and the wire are bound to each other very, very tightly. And we're going to show you how to make those ties. But where I just put the green loops, we want those to be loose, just to hold the cane at times to the wire, but not have a tight tie or it will girdle and cause problems. So we want it to be loose so that as the cane grows through the growing season, it won't be injured by the tie. So we'll show you how to make that kind of loose tie in the upcoming videos. Here once again is a picture from the Finger Lakes, and the pinnacle is the area overlooking Keuka Lake near Branchport, and all those white dots are the twist ties that were used years ago to tie umbrella niffin trained vines onto the trellis. There's one of the twist ties, and we're going to show you how to utilize that piece of tying material that is used a lot. Well, that's it. That's the beginning of tying grapevines. We wanted to show you all the different ways that you would tie vines in the vineyard. What we're going to do in the next video is to talk about the many kinds of tying materials that you can choose from when performing this important vineyard task. Until then, happy grape growing.